Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. As Aideen said, I work on the Irish Sporting Heritage Project, so I'm always interested in information on particularly grounds. It's the built heritage that I'm interested in, but those grounds contain stories and histories, and so it's always great for me to be able to speak to different groups of people who will have experience. It's right across the country, but actually I haven't really done enough work on Dublin yet, so any information that comes in on that I'd be very grateful for. The most striking new building on the Dublin skyline is, of course, the Aviva Stadium. I've been told by people who've done, is it called the Dublin Eye or the Wheel, that when you look down, it's just magnificent, this new stadium. As Lansdowne Road, it was the oldest rugby ground in the world and first hosted athletics in 1872. The original stadium was multi-sports, which included a cinder track for athletics, a cricket pitch, a croquet green, 3 football pitches, and facilities for archery and lawn tennis. And I've no photos of that or sketches. I'd love to see what it looked like as a multi-sports venue at that time. But now that site on Lansdowne Road has been transformed into a remarkable piece of 21st century architecture. The Sunday Tribune last week noted that for the cost of saving Anglo-Irish Bank, the country could have built 25 state-of-the-art hospitals or 20 Aviva stadiums. It's more expensive than a hospital. €410 million the Aviva Stadium cost. So it's an obvious part of the built sporting heritage of the city, and it can be seen clearly from several vantage points. But some other significant venues are almost hidden from public view, while others have almost vanished altogether. Actually, this is part of the evolution from Lansdowne Road to the Aviva Stadium. That concrete grandstand, very much of its time built in 1925, and then just before demolition, and then the process of this magnificent glass structure. I remember whenever Castle Court, or maybe it was the Waterfront Hall in Belfast, was built, and it was just between ceasefires, I think, and nobody could believe that anybody built a glass structure in Belfast. And when it's a sign of a peaceful society that you can have a signature building in your city built of glass. But that grandstand actually echoes, the one at Lansdowne Road echoes in some ways. This is the grandstand in Baldoyle Racecourse. Racing in Baldoyle began in 1829 on the Deer Park on a course laid out by racing enthusiast and landowner Thomas, 3rd Earl of Howth. There was a slight hiatus then in the 1840s, but racing returned to Baldoyle in 1853. The site was perfect as it was served by the Drogheda and Howth Railway Company, who regularly sponsored races. The races at Baldoyle became hugely popular. They were cheap to attend, and the racecourse wasn't enclosed. So they were also popular with hawkers, tricksters and pickpockets who could work the crowds. And one of the reasons for enclosing sports grounds through the course of the 19th century was to keep the tricksters and hawksters out, or at the very least to make money out of the money they were going to make. So that regulation of the populace, of those who assembled at racetracks, was very much part of the development of sporting sites throughout the 19th century. In the 20th century, Baldoyle continued to have an important place in Ireland's sporting history, and its reinforced concrete stand heralded the beginning of the influence of modernism on sporting architecture. This is the first of its kind in Ireland, and it was in Baldoyle. It was built for Baldoyle in 1918. That bold, plain, concrete appearance was radical. But in 1973, the insurers could no longer insure the grandstand, and so in part because of that, racing ceased in Baldoyle in the 1970s. And now the area, we have one piece of it stands here, you can see on the left, and on the right, amazingly, I think Carlow Rugby Club bought the jockey changing rooms in 1972 and moved them themselves from Baldoyle to Carlow, and they're still there. It's a lovely little corrugated iron building, and we still have that left from the very famous, one of the most famous race courses in the world, and and now these are all that remain, and there are 2,000 houses on the site where Baldoyle Racecourse used to be. There was racing as well in the Phoenix Park, which racing began there in 1901. And the Phoenix Plate for 2-year-olds was held over 5 furlongs until 1913 and was the richest race in the country, surpassing even the Irish Derby at the time. But the popularity of racing in the Phoenix Park dropped after its heyday in the 1950s and ceased altogether in 1990, and that land is now also apartment blocks. So the history of sporting sites in Dublin shifts and changes, and this was particularly true of the years of the boom. And it seemed to us that nobody was paying any attention, as apartment blocks gobbled all before them. That development across the city, and nobody, as people did, I suppose, often quote John Healy, but nobody shouted stop. So it was clear that a great deal of the Irish sporting landscape was changing, and not only were we not recording this change, we had no clear record of what had been there in the first place. So it was possible to have vast tracts, the amount of land a racecourse takes up, and that could go and houses could be put up over it, and nobody had any real record of what, they would just disappear from view. So in setting up the Irish Sporting Heritage Project, which was the brainchild of Mike Cronin and Boston College, our first aim was to compile a record of the sporting sites of Ireland. The Department of Tourism, Culture and Sport was already attempting an audit of its facilities through the county councils, but we were attempting to do something slightly different. We wanted to map the sporting landscape of Ireland over the last 150 years. It's almost impossible a task. And we have approached the project as historians, and that makes a difference. It gives it a different dimension to the audit of facilities that the county councils have undertaken. We see sporting sites as social spaces. So we want to reach an understanding of their significance in Ireland historically, politically, economically and culturally. We want to retrieve the stories that these locations hold, the memories, the tensions, the social networks and hierarchies which they have reinforced and challenged. And actually the 2 papers that have preceded this one are perfect examples of the way in which sporting clubs and sporting sites operate within communities and form ties and form associations, but create outlets and networks. And as Hilary said at the end of her paper, they also reflect, and then also Kieran very clearly laid out as well with Bohemian, the way in which they reflect the broader history of the city. This is not simply a history of one small group of people. They all have contacts into the broader society, and we wanted to use the sites in which sport have been played to tell these stories and to link in to the broader social, political and economic history of Ireland. So I've got a website. I'll just do a little plug for it. The Irish Sporting Heritage website. The website www.irishsportingheritage.com, and you can see we have the database up, and this is what it looks like. It's done by county and by sport, so you can put in and search hockey in Dublin or tennis in Dublin or anywhere around the country. Or you can put in your keyword. So please look it up. If your club isn't properly represented or not represented at all, or if there's something you know about, I'd be really delighted to have the information. And it is important that these sites are recorded. I think I was looking recently through a history of architecture in Dublin, and I looked up the Phoenix Park, and they have listed every gate lodge and monument in the Phoenix Park, and they don't mention sport. It seemed extraordinary to me that. So there's a real blindness. And I'm also putting together a dictionary entry for the Dictionary of Irish Architecture and on sporting sites. And it's really, really hard to get the information. So but the information, people in Ireland hold that information. It's held informally in people's heads, in their attics, in their memories and histories. It's not held in official places, and that's why this archive is hugely important, I think, because it will be a common place where people can come to retrieve that information. So I'm just going to show you 2 maps. I won't spend too much time on them, but I really like these 2 maps. That's why I'm going to show you them. To give you a sense of how it works on a national scale, and then I'll talk specifically about Dublin. This map I found, 1916, you know, there's somebody sitting with their ballpoint pen. It's like a little manuscript, you know, because there's nothing else, you know, to do in 1916. But put all the golf clubs in Ireland onto a map, and you can see really clearly from this map how important the railway networks were to the development of sport in Ireland. So that when we think of a map of the sporting map of Ireland, we can see multiple maps. It's all about associations and transport links and networks, and there you have it very clearly. I think there are only 3 that aren't located very close to a railway line. And this one here as well, in terms of the sporting map and landscape, I went through all the sporting calendars through the 19th century, and what you see with the racing calendars, what you see is a much more informal process at the end of the 19th century, and eventually becomes much more formalised, so that the number of race courses becomes reduced and reduced and reduced until, I think, is it 25 or 30 there are today. But look, this is an all-Ireland map. Look at the north east and the northwest. And what you see now, there were point-to-points throughout Ulster. But the racing calendar, when I was going through it, I was thinking, I'm from County Antrim. I was thinking, I'm not seeing anything from County Antrim on this. You know, obscure places, I thought I'd surely know them. So a sporting map of Ireland is also a religious map of Ireland. It'll also tell you a story about the relationship between Presbyterianism and gambling in Ireland. So that when we layer these things, so sport can tell us almost anything we ask of it. You know, it can tell us about the position of women in society. It can tell us about class politics, about urban development, about the difference between the shipyard culture in Belfast and the less industrialised aspect of Dublin culture. It tells us all of these stories. So if we map it and record it, then we have a whole new way to approach history. So what kinds of stories are being told by the city? I suppose that's one of the things I'm going to look at today. So I'll first say something about the way in which history is impacted into the way in which it's located in the places where sport has been played, even when the name changes, or even when stands are changed one by one, and even when the location itself changes. There still is a traceable memory of sport in that area. And then I look at, and I suppose I'd be interested to hear what you think of that. I'm not saying anything definitive, I'm just kind of throwing out a few thoughts on it. And then I look at the relationship between sporting sites and social structures in Dublin, and then I'll say something briefly about the way in which economic matters influence the development of sport. And Kieran's already alluded to some of those things. So it's just a brief overview, and really the interest for me will be much more what you have to say, or what, you know, the information that's held out there rather than the information I have already. So some places are no longer in existence, like Baldoyle Racecourse in the Phoenix Park. They're half remembered and still just about traceable. For others, like the former home of Shamrock Rovers, which was also victim to developers, there is a determination to remember. So the fans erected this little to Shamrock Rovers, and in my other incarnation, my other interest is the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising. So I've looked at commemorations to the Rising around the country, and I have to say that challenges many of them in its commitment and grandeur. You won't see a better commemorative monument anywhere in the country, really. And it shows these places matter to people. Sporting sites matter to the communities in which they take place. So fans do have a strong sense of loyalty to the location and the history of the place, if at times not the name. The Aviva Stadium has been described by its architects, populace, as the first truly site-responsive stadium of its kind in the world. Its form, mass, materials and aspect, they said, are defined by the site. That's the site and its surrounds. So they see it very clearly located in that part of Dublin. Dublin rugby fans said very little, as far as I know, about the renaming of their national stadium on Lansdowne Road, but they might have been more exercised if it had been decided to relocate it, or to Thomond Park in Limerick, and there was some talk of the headquarters of rugby. You know, the perfectly good stadium in Limerick, why don't we relocate it there? They made enough noise about having to travel to the north side of the city for a few years. I don't know what they would have, what rugby fans would have said about having to go to Limerick. So you can see these links to places. Sometimes it's the name, sometimes it's a place, but it's no accident where these sporting grounds build up. So these grounds are embedded in the social, cultural and economic environment in which they are located, and they remain as markers of how the city itself evolved. Speaking of the north side, a familiar ground, the headquarters of the GAA, working on Irish sporting heritage. A lot of people think Irish sporting heritage is just the GAA because it's the Irish sport, but it's not, of course, everything that takes place in Ireland is part of the Irish heritage. But this is a photograph of Croke Park in 1948. Now, Croke Park has seen several phases of development and alteration. It's an extraordinary venue. It's Europe's oldest modern stadium and predates the Stade de France by several years. As well as being the first of its type, the building is probably the largest ever built in Dublin in terms of mass. But of course, when Frank Dinnan bought the ground in 1908 for £3,250, the site on Jones's Road was very different. He made improvements to the pitch and added terracing, and the ground had already evolved by the time the GAA bought it off him in 1913 and called it Croke Memorial Park. But Croke Park is a very good example of the way in which a site can modernise without losing its sense of history. It has been renovated many times, most dramatically through the four-phase development begun in the 1980s, which culminated in 2005 with the opening of the new Hill 16, that's what it was called. Even these words give some idea of how successfully Croke Park has negotiated this transition. How much of the original rubble from Sackville Street remains on Hill 16? I mean, there can't be very much. But it's important to people that there's some of it, that some of it's there, and it's still in the official tour. This is made up of the rubble from Sackville Street. No matter how unpopular the Catholic clergy becomes in Ireland, and I was watching the Sky News about how they couldn't sell their 2,000 tickets to go and see the Pope. No matter how unpopular the Catholic clergy is, I can't imagine how GAA fans would respond to the changing of the name Croke Park. Say, we don't want a ground called for an archbishop. You know, there isn't going to be, that sense of history is very, very important. Or how would people respond if Croke Park was to be moved somewhere else? The GAA knows very well that its place in Irish society is also connected to its place in Irish history. It is a core part of the GAA brand, which is not to diminish it, it's also a core part of its culture. As with the National Stadium, GAA clubs across the country use the naming of grounds and clubs as a way of remembering both historical and religious figures. And William Murphy had that brilliant list of the names of clubs in the 1920s, in the wake of the Rising and during the War of Independence. And currently there's Parnell Park, obviously, and the Wild Geese, Thomas Davis and Round Tower clubs being some of the names that are used to connect GAA grounds and clubs very clearly to the broader history of the country. And that's Croke Park today. I mean, that's quite a journey, really. But all, you know, the stands, there's a new Nally stand, and so you keep the name. Think again of an aerial view of Dublin and some of the expansive areas in which sport has been played. They tell us about which groups had access to land in some ways in the 19th century. And we can see the ways in which formalised sport with its built facilities were first part of elite leisure culture. And if we think in particular, I suppose, a good example of that is the Phoenix Park. The first recorded cricket match in Ireland took place in the Phoenix Park in 1792 for a wager of 500 guineas between the garrison and All Ireland. The future Duke of Wellington, who was then the aide-de-camp of the Lord Lieutenant, is reputed to have participated on the Irish side. And with that kind of elite background, nevertheless, the Phoenix Park is now the most important multi-sports venue in Dublin, despite the fact that when people tell the history of it and when you do the tours, they'll take you to the zoo, but they won't take you to the sporting sites, even though that's how most people experience Phoenix Park. So we have this this great variety of things happening. You see the motor racing, speed trials. I actually looked in terms of the modern world, coming to Ireland. Sport was one of the things that really did that. The Gordon Bennett motor race that was held in 1903 in Carlow, Kildare and Laois. They reckon there were about 300 cars in Ireland in 1903, and 350 came over on one boat to see the Gordon Bennett motor race. I mean, imagine what that does to a society. And they had speed trials a lot in the Phoenix Park in the early 20th century. And the motor racing in 1929 was the precursor of the Grand Prix, and 100,000 people turned up in the Phoenix Park to see that. So the spectacle of sport, I think, and the memory, because we all remember the big sporting moments. I'd say people from Tipperary will be talking about, last Sunday for a long time. We remember those moments. And look at this, another space within Dublin that tells you about, I suppose, where an elite played at one point, and now there's more general access. Games have been prohibited in the college by Trinity's 17th century statutes, but to prevent students taking their exercise outside college walls, the authorities acceded to the demands for sporting facilities over the next 300 years. And now it's one of the key things that visitors notice about Dublin when they look over the wall on the 46A and see people playing cricket, and they see the pavilion. So it's very much part of Dublin's heritage and its history. The cricket ground was laid out in 1842, and just over 10 years later, the football ground was also laid out in Trinity. Sports such as cricket and rugby, associated at the outset with English public schools and the middle classes, spread across Ireland at the end of the 19th century, and we can see through this not just the social networks of the landed gentry, the British Army and the railway lines, but also the way in which Irish society was becoming increasingly regulated, the way in which it began to adopt sports that were more formalised. What we can see at the end of the 19th century is the increasing realisation that regulating leisure practices benefits and facilitates the regulation of society itself, and the GAA was part of that. It was in the game at a particularly important level. So it is part philanthropy and part common sense that as some employers sponsor teams, and in the case of Guinness, this eventually led to the opening of the Ivy Grounds in the Crumlin Road in 1928. The brewery had supported the establishment of the St James's Gate Athletic and Cycling Union in 1905, but its activities had been limited by the lack of grounds. So the union petitioned the brewery, and in the years following the First World War, a trust was formed, and eventually the ground was opened by Rupert Guinness in 1928. And at the point at which it was opened, it contained a football field, bowling green, grass courts, and a pavilion with a grandstand. So you can see, in many ways, these sports, they're international sports, but they have a local history. They're as local as Guinness, and all the people who worked in the brewery and were part of that. And sports grounds develop out of lots of different reasons: communities coming together, employers coming together, the patronage of the landed gentry, all of these different things. And each one has a different story to tell. Just very quickly then to signal some of the cricket, tennis clubs. These aren't as visible as the stadiums, but they are part of the community, and they have they show an incredible commitment on the part of people who participate in them. So you have Clontarf and Leinster, and these change and evolve. I suppose that's the difficulty for me, really. They change, but we haven't necessarily recorded. They'll say in club histories, it'll say the Victorian Pavilion was knocked down due to dry rot in whatever year, and then we've got this brilliant, and there's no photo of the Victorian Pavilion, and I could weep, really. Or somewhere, like Herbert Park, there's some great examples, of this horseshoe throwing area at the bottom, and the croquet and bowls and tennis, all in this part of South Dublin. And another building, and Jimmy McGee apparently mentioned it earlier today, I don't think I have a slide of it. No, I don't, sorry. The National Boxing Stadium. It tells its own story. Now, boxing is an international sport, and fist fighting, pugilism, was one of the most popular sports, I suppose, in Ireland in the 18th century. It was one of the first sports to have a written code. But by the 19th century, it was seen as very much an unruly it was difficult to control. So the sort of the official view of it was that people who attended fist fights were participating in riotous assemblies. So it became quite difficult for it until the production of the Queensberry Rules in 1867. So it's actually an interesting sport in terms of one that was seen as, you know, as a working class sport, and the class issue is always there in sport. But, you know, that working class male aggression, it was a danger, and then actually it was something that if it could be controlled and put into productive use, could actually serve the society. So, and we can see that very much then in Ireland, that shift, and we see lots of Catholic young men's societies build boxing clubs and boxing halls, and then with the formation of the Free State, boxing actually became quite a central feature, as it was seen as a way of training the new police and army. So boxing was something, and I suppose it still has. And Jimmy McGee, I saw him launch the Fighting Irish exhibition in Croke Park. It's, you know, Ireland has had more success in boxing than any other sport, and yet it isn't seen as a mainstream sport in the country. Probably isn't given the kind of recognition that it deserves. But anyway, with the formation of the Free State and this recognition that in order to be healthy and in order to maintain the strength of the state, it was necessary to maintain the physicality of the police and the army. Boxing became, you know, had a particular focus, and in 1936 it was decided to build this national stadium. And Frank Aiken, who was Minister of Defence, was on the committee, as was the police commissioner. So it had support at a very high level, and ground from Griffith Barracks was given over to it, and it was open in 1939. And what Jimmy McGee has said is that what is the most remarkable thing about it is that this building is, in fact, that the Irish Amateur Boxing Association is the only amateur boxing association in the world to control, run and own its national arena and stadium. So you can see, you know, from the Croquet Club in Herbert Park to the National Boxing Stadium on South Circular Road, the number of stories that tells us about this city. And when they were building the National Stadium, it was explicitly said in the Irish Times, give money because this is a poor person's sport. So we need to have money. So there was always a recognition of those divisions of class within the sporting environment. And just then, as a last example, I'll say something about a very commercial sport. I'm just throwing out some different kinds of sports that you might not necessarily think about whenever you think about Dublin's heritage. Greyhound racing is a 20th century invention. It really was part of it grew in the 1920s and just spread like wildfire from North America to Britain through Ireland. Flann O'Brien, writing of it in 1940, said that it seemed to fill perfectly a void which, in the absence of horse racing at night, had existed in the spiritual and intellectual consciousness of the people, so that desperate need to be able to gamble in the evenings. And what greyhound racing had was, it was very cheap to develop. That's why it became so popular, because it didn't need its own grounds. So you could put the gambling machines or the gambling areas and the track around existing football grounds, and that's what they did. Shelburne, you'll see that, you know, at the top, it's seen, I suppose, as the headquarters of greyhound racing in Ireland. And it's always been very commercially driven, and now I suppose we can see that very much in the way in which the greyhound stadiums have developed, although there are still some of the share grounds. The Galway Greyhound track shares its grounds. So there are lots of different ways, and you can see also the Speedway. That was quite short-lived, but quite an important part of Shelburne's experience in Dublin. So we can see, if we think of the Dalymount Parks, the Croke Parks, Shelburne, the private clubs, the Phoenix Park, Trinity College, the boxing stadium, there are hundreds of stories of Dublin's heritage that really we're trying to collect and get as much information about as we can. And in turn, these sites tell us something about the changes in the social lives, economics, attitudes to health and to leisure that we have in the city. so that the history of sport in Dublin is also the story of how the city and its people have grown and developed over time.